The heavy glass of a shattered $5,000 ornament sliced into Kate's palm just seconds before Anthony's polished loafer connected with her ribs. The force sent her sprawling across the marble floor of the Grand Plaza Mall, her designer cut-out dress snagging on a jagged metal display. For a heartbeat, the high-end boutique fell into a deafening silence. Kate looked up through a curtain of hair, the copper tang of blood filling her mouth as she stared at the man towering over her, his face twisted into a mask of pure arrogance. Anthony, her ex, the man who had robbed her of her savings, her dignity, and the child she had been carrying 3 years ago. "Stay down in the dirt where you belong, you pathetic loser," Anthony spat, adjusted his cufflinks as if he hadn't just committed an assault in broad daylight. He had no idea. He saw the same broken, penniless girl who had begged for scraps while he walked away. He didn't realize that the woman who once had $12 in her bank account and a hollow ache in her womb was dead. He had no clue about the black label security detail already pivoting toward this wing of the mall. He didn't see the way the store manager's face had turned paper white, not because of the violence, but because of who was being hurt. Most importantly, Anthony didn't know about the man whose name now shielded Kate like a suit of armor. Jiho, the underground king who had pulled her from the wreckage of her old life and made her his queen. As Kate's trembling fingers brushed the silent alarm on her watch, the mall's PA system let out a low, ominous hum. Anthony was still smirking, oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own death warrant. In less than 5 minutes, Jiho's motorcade would block every exit, and Anthony would learn that some debts are paid in blood. But right now, in this moment, he still thought she was nothing. That was his first mistake. It would also be his last. Before we dive deeper into this story of love, revenge, and redemption, I want to wish you all a blessed and magical New Year season. May your new year be filled with love, joy, and beautiful moments with those who matter most. Now, do me a favor by subscribing to the channel now and turn on notifications. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's get into this dramatic journey. The light in the penthouse didn't just shine. It glowed, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a skyline Kate once viewed only from the windows of a crowded bus. She stirred against silk sheets that felt like cool water against her skin, the silence of the morning broken only by the rhythmic, steady breathing of the man beside her. Jiho was a man the world described in hushed, terrified whispers, the underground king, a shadow that moved mountains of capital and hushed the loudest tongues. But here, in the amber glow of the rising sun, he was simply the man whose arm was draped possessively across her waist, his thumb tracing slow, subconscious circles over her hip, even in his sleep. Kate watched him for a moment, her heart aching with a familiar mix of disbelief and devotion. 3 years ago, she had been a hollow shell, shivering in a drafty apartment with nothing but the echo of Anthony's laughter as he walked away with her future. Now, her biggest concern was which piece of high jewelry Jiho would insist she wear for a simple shopping trip. As if sensing her gaze, Jiho's eyes opened. There was no grogginess, only an immediate, sharp focus that softened the second it landed on her. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. He reached up, his fingers tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that contradicted the jagged scar running down his forearm. "Did you have the dream again?" "No," Kate lied softly, though the ghost of a cold floor sometimes still visited her sleep. Jiho didn't believe her. He saw everything, but he chose to offer comfort instead of a critique. He pulled her closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his grip tightening just enough to remind her she was anchored. "Today is for you," he reminded her. "Go to the mall. Buy the things that make you feel like the queen you are. My men will be with you, invisible but ready." He pulled back, reaching for the nightstand to produce a small, velvet box. Inside sat a black card, its weight heavy and cold, a symbol of limitless power. But it was the way he looked at her as he handed it over that truly mattered. His eyes weren't on the card. They were on her face, searching for any flicker of the sadness he had spent years trying to erase. "If anyone breathes the wrong way in your direction, Kate," he said, his voice dropping into that deadly, calm register that made his enemies tremble. "The world stops until they are dealt with. Remember whose name you carry." Kate nodded, leaning into his kiss, feeling the warmth of his lips mask the fatting scars of her past. She stepped out of bed, her feet sinking into the plush rug, feeling untouchable. She had no way of knowing that within hours, the protective walls of this penthouse would feel miles away as a ghost from her past prepared to strike. The air in the luxury boutique smelled of expensive sandalwood and fresh lilies, a scent that usually acted as a balm to Kate's nerves. She moved through the racks of silk and structured wool, the weight of her husband's black card in her clutch acting as a silent anchor. Her security detail, led by the stoic Minho, hovered at a respectful distance, blending into the shadows of the marble pillars. For the first time in years, Kate felt like she was breathing air that belonged to her. She reached for a structured blazer, her fingers grazing the fabric, when a voice cut through the soft jazz playing over the speakers. It was a sharp, grating laugh, a sound that acted like a jagged blade against the skin of her memory. Kate froze. Her lungs, which had felt so full only moments ago, suddenly constricted until they were nothing more than tight, burning knots in her chest. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at her to run, she turned her head. Across the expanse of the boutique, standing near a display of Italian leather bags, was Anthony. He looked exactly as he did the day he had pushed her out of their shared life, polished, arrogant, and wearing a suit that cost more than the rent he had stolen from her. He was gesturing wildly to a junior associate, his face twisted in that familiar expression of a man who believed the world was beneath his feet. The boutique's golden light seemed to dim as a cold, visceral wave of panic crashed over Kate. Suddenly, the velvet carpet felt like the cracked linoleum of the apartment where he had left her. The designer dress she wore felt as thin as the rags she'd owned when she was starving. Her hands began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that started in her fingertips and moved to her heart. He's here, the internal monologue of the survivor, the one she thought Jiho had silenced with his love, roared back to life. Hide. Don't let him see you. You're nothing. You're worthless. She felt her posture wilt, her shoulders hunching as if trying to make herself small enough to disappear into the drywall. The trauma wasn't a memory. It was a living thing, a predator that had been waiting in the tall grass of her subconscious for this exact moment. She tried to take a step back, to signal Minho, but her legs felt like lead. Her peripheral vision narrowed until all she could see was Anthony's profile. He was moving closer, his eyes scanning the room with a hunter's indifference. In that moment, Kate Peters, the wife of the underground king, vanished. In her place stood the girl with $17 in her bank account and a bruise on her soul. She reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling for her phone, for the one-touch dial that would bring her husband's world crashing down on this mall. But her thumbs stalled. The fear was a physical weight on her throat, keeping her silent as the ghost of her past turned his head and locked his eyes onto hers. The moment Anthony's eyes locked onto hers, the recognition was instantaneous and predatory. He didn't look at her with regret or even surprise. He looked at her with the amused contempt of a man finding a discarded toy in a trash heap. He crossed the boutique with a swagger that made the air feel heavy and toxic, closing the distance before Kate's frozen limbs could find the strength to retreat. "Kate," he asked, his voice dripping with a mock sweetness that turned her stomach. He didn't wait for an answer. He circled her, his eyes raking over her cut-out black dress with a clinical, insulting slowness. "Well, look at you. I heard you were still scraping by, but I see you found a way to dress the part." Kate tried to find her voice, to find the woman who sat at the head of a mahogany dining table with a king, but her throat felt like it was filled with glass. "Anthony," she managed to whisper, the name tasting like ash. He let out a short, bark-like laugh, stepping into her personal space until she could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "Don't tell me. Let me guess. Who's the poor fool paying for the wardrobe, Kate? Or is this just a try-on for a photo you'll post before you return it?" He reached out, his fingers catching a loose thread on her sleeve and tugging it with a sharp, dismissive jerk. "Because we both know you don't belong in a place like this. You couldn't afford the shoelaces in this boutique when I left you, and a girl like you doesn't change. She just finds bigger pockets to pick. His words were like venom, injected directly into the wounds he had carved years ago. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a hiss that was meant only for her. You think because you're wearing a designer rag that you've scrubbed the scent of poverty off your skin. You're a gold digger, Kate. A cheap one, at that. I bet you're here waiting for some old man to finish his meeting so you can beg for a trinket. The cruelty in his eyes was blinding. He saw the way her hands shook, and it only emboldened him. He didn't see the silent, dark-suited men moving like shadows toward the edge of the boutique. He didn't see the way Minho's hand had drifted toward his jacket. Anthony only saw the girl he had broken, the one who had cried while he took everything. Go back to the gutter, Kate, he sneered, his face inches from hers. Before you get caught stealing something you can't pay back. You're nothing but a beautiful void, and trust me, eventually, every man realizes that. The silence following Anthony's venomous words was brittle, a thin sheet of ice waiting to crack. Kate felt the stares of the other shoppers, eyes heavy with judgment, assuming the worst of a black woman being berated in a space that rarely welcomed her without suspicion. The shame was a physical weight, pinning her tongue to the roof of her mouth. I asked you a question, Kate, Anthony snapped, his patience evaporating as her silence denied him the satisfaction of a plea. Or did the man who bought that dress not pay for your brain, too? Leave me alone, Anthony, she whispered, her voice trembling but finally audible. She tried to sidestep him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I'm not that girl anymore, just let me go. The rejection, however small, ignited the volatile ego Anthony had always carried like a torch. His face darkened, the polished businessman mask slipping to reveal the monster underneath. Don't you turn your back on me, he hissed. As Kate moved to walk past him, his hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with a bruising force. With a violent, dismissive grunt, he shoved her away from him. The world tilted. Kate's heels skidded on the polished marble, and she went flying backward. She collided with a towering tiered display of limited edition crystal Christmas ornaments. The crash was deafening, a symphonic explosion of shattering glass and metal. Kate hit the floor hard, her elbow barking against the marble as a jagged shard of a $5,000 centerpiece sliced a shallow red line across her palm. She lay there, gasping, her black dress fanned out like a mourning shroud amidst the glittering debris. Anthony stood over her, breathing hard, his eyes wide with a manic sort of triumph. Look at you, he mocked, gesturing to the wreckage. Always breaking things, always a liability. You'll be lucky if they don't throw you in jail for the cost of those ornaments. God knows you can't pay for them. But the atmosphere in the boutique had shifted. The jazz music didn't stop, but the air grew heavy, charged with a sudden, lethal static. Anthony was too busy gloating to notice the subtle ripple in the room. He didn't see Minho, who had been a statue in the corner, touch his earpiece with a cold, mechanical precision. He didn't notice the four men in identical charcoal suits who had suddenly appeared at every exit, their faces devoid of emotion, their stances wide and predatory. The invisible security team was no longer invisible. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying grace, closing the circle around the shattered display. Anthony finally sensed the change, his smirk faltering as he looked up to find himself surrounded by men whose eyes held the emptiness of a graveyard. Kate looked down at the blood blooming in her palm, and for the first time that day, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharpening clarity. She knew that look in Minho's eyes. It was the look of a man who was already counting down the seconds of Anthony's life. Anthony's laughter died in his throat as the heavy silence of the boutique curdled into something suffocating. He looked around at the wall of suits closing in, his bravado flickering like a dying candle. What is this? He blustered, stepping back toward the shattered display where Kate still knelt. You think these mall cops are going to save you from the bill for this mess? I know the manager here. I'm here to see the CEO of the Shin HWA group. Kate didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Her trembling fingers reached into the debris, finding her phone where it had slid across the marble. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures mirroring the chaos around her, but the interface was still glowing. With a thumb stained by a thin trail of blood, she swiped the emergency icon. a direct line that bypassed every assistant and every firewall in Jiho's empire. The call was answered before the first ring could even finish. There was no greeting on the other end, only the heavy, expectant silence of a man who already knew something was wrong. "Jiho," Kate whispered, her voice cracking. "Now." The line went dead. That was the signal. In an instant, the very soul of the mall shifted. It started with the sound. The overhead music abruptly cut out, replaced by the low, mechanical thrum of the building's security shutters being triggered. The bright, inviting LED screens that usually flashed advertisements for perfumes and watches went pitch black, then flickered to life with a single, glowing red crest. The sigil of the Kim family. Anthony spun around, his eyes wide as he watched the boutique's heavy glass doors slide shut with a definitive metallic asterisk clack. "Hey, what's going on? Open the doors," he shouted at a staff member, but the clerk was backed against a wall, staring at Minho with sheer terror. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The invisible men who had surrounded Anthony didn't touch him. They simply stood like stone monoliths, their shadows stretching long and dark across the floor. They weren't protecting the store. They were a cage. Kate stood up slowly, wiping the blood from her palm onto the dark fabric of her dress. She felt the shift in her own blood, the warmth of Jiho's protection wrapping around her like a physical cloak. Outside, the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens began to grow, not the high-pitched chirp of police, but the deep, guttural roar of a motorcade that moved with the authority of an invading army. "You wanted to meet the investor, Anthony," Kate said, her voice finally cold, finally steady. "You wanted to show him your worth." She looked at the blackout screens and then back at her ex-fiancé's paling face. "He's coming, and he doesn't like it when people touch his things." The roar of the motorcade reached the atrium before the cars were even visible, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the remaining crystal ornaments on the shelves. Outside the high-security glass, a fleet of 12 obsidian-black SUVs swerved into the mall's VIP circle with military precision, drifting to a synchronized halt that effectively choked off every exit. The scent of burnt rubber seeped through the ventilation as the engines cut out in unison. Inside the boutique, the mall manager, Mr. Han, stumbled forward, his face the color of bleached bone. He had spent his career catering to the elite, but he knew the difference between a wealthy customer and a sovereign power. When he saw the red sigil on the digital displays and the motorcade outside, his knees buckled. He didn't look at Anthony. He looked at the doors as if he were waiting for a hurricane to make landfall. "Unlock the doors now," Anthony barked, his voice thin and reedy as he grabbed Mr. Han's shoulder. "I have a meeting. This is a kidnapping. Do you know who I am?" Mr. Han shoved Anthony's hand off with a sudden, frantic strength. "You fool," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terror so pure it silenced Anthony's protests. "That isn't a meeting. That is the king, and you are standing in the middle of his wife's blood." The central doors didn't just open. They hissed apart with a sound like a guillotine. A phalanx of men in identical charcoal suits marched in first, forming two impenetrable lines that carved a path from the curb to the center of the store. They didn't look left or right. Their presence alone cleared the air of oxygen. Then he appeared. Kim Jiho stepped into the boutique, and the very light seemed to bend toward him. He wasn't wearing a coat, despite the winter chill, just a tailored black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of a tattoo that climbed his throat. His face was a mask of terrifying, glacial stillness. He didn't look at the manager, who was now bowed so low his forehead touched the marble. He didn't look at the dozens of security guards who had dropped to their knees. His eyes were locked solely on Kate. He took 3 long, purposeful strides across the floor. As he passed Anthony, the air pressure seemed to drop, but Jiho didn't even grant the man a glance. He reached Kate, his large, scarred hands reaching out to frame her face with a gentleness that was more frightening than his anger. His gaze dropped to her palm, where the red line of the glass cut stood out against her skin. A single muscle in Jiho's jaw jumped. The silence in the mall was so absolute that the sound of his thumb brushing over her wound sounded like a prayer. "Who?" Jiho asked, his voice a low, melodic rumble that promised a slow and methodical end to the world. decided today was the day they wanted to die. Jiho's touch was feather-light, but Kate could feel the heat radiating from him, a controlled volcanic pressure. He didn't just see the blood on her palm. He seemed to absorb the sight of it, his pupils dilating until his eyes were twin voids of midnight. When his gaze traveled further, catching the jagged tear in her dress and the faint, rising bruise on her ribs where Anthony's boot had connected, the man who had kissed her forehead that morning vanished. In his place stood the demon. It was a physical transformation, a hardening of his features into something statuesque and ancient. The tenderness in his hands didn't disappear, but it became a sharp, terrifying contrast to the aura of death that now filled the boutique. "Jiho," Kate whispered, her voice a plea for him to stay tethered to her, but he was already drifting into that cold, dark place where mercy was a forgotten language. He slowly let go of her face, his fingers lingering for a heartbeat before he turned. The movement was fluid, like a predator pivoting toward a scent. Anthony was standing less than 10 feet away, frozen in a state of cognitive dissonance. He looked at Jiho, a man whose face was plastered on every business journal and feared in every backroom, and then at Kate, the worthless girl he had kicked into the dirt. "You," Jiho said. The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Anthony's mouth opened and closed, his throat working convulsively. You don't understand, Mr. Kim. This woman, she's a con artist. She's my ex-fiancée. She was causing a scene, and I." The air in the mall seemed to shiver. Jiho didn't wait for the explanation. He stepped toward Anthony, and with every footfall, the circle of enforcers tightened. The mall manager was audibly sobbing now, a rhythmic, pathetic sound against the silence. "She is my wife," Jiho corrected him, his voice a deadly, calm rasp that vibrated in the marrow of Kate's bones. "And you have spilled the blood of the queen." Jiho reached out, his hand moving with a speed the human eye could barely track. He didn't strike Anthony. He grabbed him by the throat, his fingers digging into the carotid artery with surgical precision. He lifted the taller man nearly off the floor, forcing Anthony to dance on his tiptoes for air. "I came here to discuss an investment," Jiho murmured, his face inches from Anthony's purpled, panicked features. "But I think I'll invest in your ruin instead. I am going to take every breath you have left and make you use it to apologize to the ground she walks on." The demon had been unleashed, and for Anthony, the world was about to become a very small, very dark room. The pressure on Anthony's throat was absolute, a physical manifestation of the power he had spent his entire life trying to court. He clawed at Jiho's wrist, his expensive manicured nails scratching uselessly against skin that felt like granite. As he dangled there, the edges of his vision beginning to gray, the horrific geometry of his situation finally clicked into place. He looked past the man crushing the life out of him toward Kate. She stood amidst the glittering ruins of the $5,000 ornament, her silhouette framed by a dozen men who looked ready to dismantle the world at her command. She wasn't the shivering girl from the apartment. She was the investor. The Shin HWA Group," Anthony wheezed, the words rattling in his constricted windpipe. Jiho's grip didn't loosen, but his eyes narrowed, a flicker of sadistic amusement dancing in the dark voids of his pupils. "You spent 6 months begging for an audience with me, Mr. Wellington. You sent 84 emails and bribed 3 of my associates just for 5 minutes of my time." The truth hit Anthony with more force than the kick he had delivered to Kate's ribs. The mysterious Korean mogul he had flown across the ocean to impress, the one man who could save his failing firm from bankruptcy, was the man holding him by the neck. And the woman he had just called a parasite and shoved into the dirt was the only person in the world that man loved. I didn't. No," Anthony gasped, tears of pure, unadulterated terror streaming down his face. "Kate, tell him, please, we have a history." "The only history I care about," Jiho interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against Anthony's ear, "is the 3 minutes you spent hurting what belongs to me. You didn't come here for an investment, Anthony. You came here for an audit. And looking at your debt to my wife, I've decided you're insolvent." Jiho didn't drop him. He leaned in closer, his aura so oppressive that the mall manager fainted a few feet away. You wanted to show me your business model? I've seen it. You destroy things. You leave them broken. Jiho's gaze flicked to Kate, and for a split second, the demon softened before hardening into something even more permanent. I am going to show you how a professional does it. Anthony looked at Kate one last time, a pathetic, silent plea for mercy in his eyes. But Kate didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a word. She simply watched him with the calm, detached gaze of a queen watching a pest being removed from her palace. The realization was final. The girl he knew was dead, and the woman who replaced her had no room for his survival. The transition from the brightly lit boutique to the windowless security suite was seamless and silent. Jiho didn't drag Anthony. His men handled the task with a clinical efficiency that made the villain look like a piece of discarded luggage. The room smelled of ozone and cold metal, a stark contrast to the lilies and luxury of the mall. Anthony was shoved into a hard chair, the bolted-down furniture a grim promise that there was no exit. Jiho stood in the corner, a shadow among shadows, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't speak. He simply watched Kate as she walked toward the center of the room. She looked down at Anthony, who was now a trembling mess of sweat and ruined silk. You told me I was a parasite, Anthony, Kate began, her voice low and steady, vibrating with the weight of years of suppressed agony. But parasites don't build. They don't nurture. I nurtured our child while you were out spending the money I earned working 3 jobs. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Jiho's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixing on the back of Anthony's head with lethal intent. This was the part of the story Kate had held close to her heart, a jagged secret she had only ever whispered into the dark. I remember the day I lost the baby, she continued, her voice hitching only once. I was on the floor of that kitchen, calling your phone while you were at a club with my life savings in your pocket. I lost my child because I couldn't afford the heat, Anthony. I lost my child because I was starving and you were investing in your image. Anthony tried to speak, his throat clicking as he swallowed dryly. Kate, it was a business move. I was going to pay it back. You left me to bleed out in a cold apartment. She cut him off, her eyes flashing with a fire that made him recoil. You robbed me of my motherhood, my dignity, and my future. You didn't just dump me, you tried to erase me. She turned slightly to look at Jiho. Her husband's face was a mask of granite, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his own arms. The revelation of the lost child was the final tether snapping. The demon of Seoul was no longer just protecting his wife's honor. He was now the judge, jury, and executioner for a life that was never allowed to begin. He needs to understand, Jiho, Kate said, her voice turning cold as ice. He needs to understand that every dollar he's made, every breath he's taken since that day, has been a debt he owes to the ghost of the woman I used to be. Jiho stepped forward, the floorboards seemingly groaning under the weight of his presence. He placed a hand on Kate's shoulder, a silent vow of retribution. He didn't look at Anthony with anger anymore. He looked at him as if he were already dead. Jiho didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled a slim, obsidian-framed tablet from the pocket of his blazer and tapped the screen once. The gesture was casual, almost bored, but the consequences were global. In the silence of the interrogation room, the only sound was the frantic tapping of keys from the tech teams stationed just outside the door, their movements a digital firing squad. You like the spotlight, don't you, Anthony? Jiho asked, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. He turned the tablet around so Anthony could see the display. The screen was a chaotic blur of progress bars and scrolling code. In the top corner, a live feed of the world's major financial news networks flickered. Suddenly, the breaking news banners transitioned from stock market updates to a grainy, high-definition photo of Anthony's face. What is that? Anthony stammered, his eyes bulging as he watched his own name scroll across the bottom of a global news ticker. That is the sound of your legacy evaporating, Jiho replied. With a final keystroke from the team outside, the floodgates opened. Files that Anthony had buried deep in encrypted drives, records of embezzled funds, offshore accounts used to hide stolen life savings, and the documented history of his systemic fraud were being broadcast to every major news outlet and regulatory agency from London to Tokyo. The investor he had come to meet wasn't just taking his future, he was erasing his past. The tablet flickered again, showing a real-time feed of Anthony's social media. The follower count wasn't just dropping. The comments sections were exploding with the vitriol of a world that had just been handed proof of his depravity. Personal messages, voice recordings of his verbal abuse, and the bank statements showing the exact moment he drained Kate's account were being shared by millions. Anthony watched in paralyzed horror as his professional reputation, built on a foundation of lies and Kate's stolen dreams, crumbled in 60 seconds. He wasn't just being ruined, he was being unmade. Every person who had ever respected him, every business partner who had ever shaken his hand, and every family member he had ever impressed was currently watching his soul be stripped bare on a digital stage. "You thought you were the predator because you could kick a woman when she was down," Jiho said, leaning over the table, his shadow swallowing Anthony whole. "But in my world, predators are quiet. You, Anthony, are just noise, and I've decided to hit the mute button." The tablet showed one final notification: assets frozen, passport revoked, investigation pending. Kate watched the light die in Anthony's eyes as he realized he no longer had a name, a penny, or a place to hide. The digital dismantling was complete. He was a ghost before he was even in the ground. Anthony's phone, discarded on the metal table, began to vibrate with a violent, unending rhythm. Notifications cascaded across the lock screen like a barrage of gunfire. First, the alerts from his private wealth manager: suspicious activity detected, accounts restricted. Then, the cold, automated finality of his primary bank: balance, $0. He reached for the device with trembling fingers, but Jiho's hand came down on the table, a sudden crack of thunder that made Anthony flinch. "Don't bother," Jiho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "There is nothing left to hold on to." On the wall-mounted monitors, the destruction moved from the digital to the physical. A live feed showed Anthony's luxury estate in the hills, the home he had purchased with the seed money he'd stolen from Kate, surrounded by black sedans. Men in tactical gear were already hauling out his designer furniture and crating his art. A bright orange, seized notice was being plastered over the mahogany front doors. Anthony watched, his mouth agape, as a tow truck hooked his custom Italian sports car, dragging it down the driveway like a trophy of war. Every symbol of the life he had built on Kate's suffering was being stripped away in a matter of minutes. "You took her life savings when she was at her most vulnerable," Jiho murmured, stepping closer until his shadow completely eclipsed Anthony. "So, I've taken yours. Every cent you've ever touched has been traced, clawed back, and redirected. You aren't just bankrupt, Anthony. You are a financial black hole. No bank will take your name. No landlord will take your signature. You don't even own the clothes you're wearing." The reality finally shattered Anthony's remaining composure. He began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound that filled the small room. "You can't do this. There are laws. I have rights." "The law is a slow instrument," Jiho replied, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. "I am a fast one, and as for your rights, you forfeited them the moment you raised your foot against my wife." Kate watched from the side, her arms crossed. Seeing the numbers on the screen hit 0 didn't feel like greed. It felt like a balance was finally being restored. The man who had mocked her for having $17 in her car was now looking at a future of absolute nothingness. The bankruptcy wasn't just in his bank account, it was in his soul. He was a beggar in a tailored suit, and the realization was a weight that finally forced his head down to the table. The silence that followed the digital execution was heavier than the noise of Anthony's sobbing. Jiho stepped back, his presence receding into the shadows just enough to give Kate the floor. He was a silent sentinel, a wall of dark muscle and absolute power, but he knew this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to the woman who had survived the wreck. Kate walked forward, her heels clicking against the cold floor with a steady, rhythmic finality. Anthony was no longer sitting. The weight of his ruin had dragged him to his knees. He was huddled on the floor, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a desperate, self-pitying grief. She stopped inches from him, looking down at the crown of his head. For 3 years, this man had been a giant in her mind. He was the monster in the closet, the architect of her greatest trauma, a shadow so vast it had threatened to blot out every sunlit moment of her new life. She had spent 1,000 nights rehearsing what she would say, fueled by a rage that felt like it could burn the world down. But as she stood over him now, the fire didn't roar. It flickered and went out. "Look at me, Anthony," she said. Her voice wasn't loud and it wasn't angry. It was something far more devastating. It was indifferent. Anthony raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and leaking tears, his nose running, his expensive hair matted to his forehead. He looked at her not with the fire of the villain she remembered, but with the hollow, frantic eyes of a trapped animal. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like a man who had never been strong, only cruel. The revelation hit Kate with a physical force. The monster who had stolen her child and her dignity hadn't been a titan. He had been a coward who only felt tall when he was standing on someone else's neck. Without his money, without his stolen status, and without the power to hurt her, he was nothing but a pathetic collection of insecurities and cheap silk. "I spent so long being afraid of you," Kate whispered, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I thought you were a force of nature, but you're just a small man, Anthony. You're so small I can't even find the energy to hate you anymore." The power dynamic didn't just shift, it vanished. The chains of trauma that had bound her to his memory for years simply fell away, turning to dust in the cold air of the room. She realized then that Jiho hadn't just destroyed Anthony's life. He had provided the stage for Kate to realize that Anthony no longer had the power to inhabit hers. She turned her back on him while he was still reaching out, a beggar pleading for a mercy she didn't owe him. She walked toward Jiho, her head held high, leaving the ghost of her past kneeling in the dark. The heavy steel doors of the security suite hissed open, and Kate stepped back into the atrium of the mall. The space was no longer a place of commerce. It had become a cathedral of silence. Jiho walked beside her, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back, a physical anchor that signaled to the world exactly who she was. As they moved across the polished marble, the shift in reality was visceral. The shoppers had been cleared, but the staff remained, lined up in a silent, trembling gauntlet that stretched from the boutique to the main entrance. Every person they passed, from the high-end jewelry consultants to the mall's elite security, dropped their heads in a synchronized, deep bow. It was a display of respect that bordered on religious awe. The sound of their footsteps was the only thing that filled the air, a steady asterisk click-clack of Kate's heels and the heavy, rhythmic stride of the king. They passed the shattered display where Kate had been sprawled only an hour before. The glass had been swept away, the blood cleaned, and a new, pristine arrangement was already being lowered into place. The mall manager, Mr. Han, was still bowed so low his spine looked ready to snap. He didn't dare breathe as Kate walked by, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Kate didn't look down. She didn't look for the fear in their eyes or the shame on their faces. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the bright, winter sunlight pouring through the glass entrance. She felt the weight of her husband's name, but more than that, she felt the weight of her own skin, finally comfortable, finally hers. The power in the room had settled. It was no longer the chaotic, jagged energy of a scuffle. It was the cold, absolute authority of a reign. Behind them, the muffled sound of Anthony being led out through a service exit, stripped of his dignity and destined for a life of shadows, was a distant, fadding echo. At the entrance, the phalanx of enforcers snapped to attention. One of them held the door open, the cold air rushing in to meet them, crisp and clean. Jiho paused for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter one last time before he looked down at Kate. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked, his voice returning to that low, private melody reserved only for her. "Yes," Kate said, and the word felt like the final period at the end of a long, brutal chapter. They stepped out into the bright afternoon, the motorcade idling like a pack of waiting wolves. As the door to the lead SUV was held open for her, Kate realized that the mall, the boutique, and even Anthony were now just small, flickering lights in her rearview mirror. She wasn't just leaving a building. She was stepping into a world that she had finally conquered. The penthouse was silent, the frantic energy of the mall replaced by the soft, golden hum of the setting sun bleeding through the windows. The city below was beginning to spark with evening lights, but inside, the world felt small, private, and safe. Jiho didn't call for the household staff. He didn't summon a doctor. Instead, he led Kate to the master suite, his hand never leaving hers. He sat her down on the edge of the expansive bed and disappeared for a moment, returning with a silver basin of warm water and a first aid kit. He knelt between her knees, the most powerful man in the city, the underground king, who had just dismantled a man's life with a single phone call, humbling himself at her feet. He took her injured hand in his touch so light it was as if he were handling a piece of ancient porcelain. "It's just a scratch, Jiho," Kate whispered, though her voice still carried the faint tremor of the day's adrenaline. "It is a mark I failed to prevent," he countered, his voice thick with a quiet, simmering guilt. He dipped a soft cloth into the warm water and began to dab away the dried blood on her palm. He worked with a meticulous, surgical focus, cleaning the shallow cut before applying a soothing salve and a clean bandage. When he finished with her hand, his gaze traveled to the darkening bruise on her ribs. His expression didn't flare with the demon's rage this time. Instead, it softened into a profound, aching tenderness. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the skin near the injury. "I can take away his money, his name, and his freedom, Kate, but I cannot take back the minute he put his hands on you. For that, I am sorry." Kate reached out with her uninjured hand, cupping his jaw and forcing him to look at her. "You did more than enough. For the first time in 3 years, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm not hiding anymore." Jiho leaned his face into her palm, closing his eyes. The tension that had held his shoulders rigid since the call at the mall finally began to dissipate. He climbed onto the bed beside her, pulling her into his lap and wrapping his arms around her like a living shield. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the steady beating of their hearts. Kate rested her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm of a man who would burn the world down just to keep her warm. The physical pain was fading, but the emotional healing was deeper. She wasn't just recovering from a scuffle. She was finally exhaling a breath she had been holding since the day Anthony had first walked away. In the safety of Jiho's arms, the worthless girl was finally, officially, a memory. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of fresh pine and hope. A year had passed since the glass had shattered at the mall, but today, the only sound was the rhythmic clapping of a gathered crowd. Kate stood before a restored colonial estate on the outskirts of the city, its white columns gleaming under the winter sun. Above the entrance, elegant brass letters caught the light, the Peters Sanctuary. It was more than a building. It was a promise. Funded by the very assets Jiho had clawed back from Anthony's ruin, the sanctuary served as a haven for women who had survived the same shadows Kate once inhabited. It offered legal aid, medical care, and most importantly, the time to breathe without fear. Jiho stood a half step behind her, his hand resting possessively on her waist. He wore no crown, but the way the city's officials and the sanctuary's residents looked at him, and the way he looked only at Kate, spoke of a different kind of royalty. He had stayed true to his word. He hadn't just protected her, he had built a fortress around her dreams. As Kate prepared to cut the ribbon, Minho approached silently and handed Jiho a small, plain envelope. Jiho glanced at the contents and then leaned into Kate's ear, his voice a warm, low vibration. "The final report," he murmured. "Anthony Wellington's last appeal was denied this morning. His name has been struck from the corporate registry. He is currently working a custodial shift at a transit hub in the north. He has $17 in his pocket, Kate, not a cent more." The symmetry was poetic, but for Kate, it was no longer about the vengeance. She looked at the envelope, then back at the women waiting for the doors to open, women who were looking at her as a beacon of what was possible. "Do you want to keep it?" Jiho asked, holding the paper that detailed her enemy's misery. Kate took the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to see the photos of a broken man to feel whole. She walked to a nearby decorative brazier lit for the ceremony and dropped the report into the flames. She watched as the ink curled and blackened, the last vestige of Anthony's existence turning into harmless gray ash that scattered in the wind. He was deleted, not just from the banks and the news, but from her soul. She turned back to the crowd, a radiant, untouchable smile on her face. With a steady hand, she snipped the silk ribbon. The doors swung open, welcoming those who were lost into a home built from the ashes of a survivor. "Let's go inside," Kate said, taking her husband's hand. "We have work to do." As they stepped across the threshold, the past was finally silent. Kate Peters wasn't just the wife of a king. She was the architect of her own kingdom, and for the first time in her life, the future was the only thing she could see. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more Afro-Korean romance stories, and comment below telling me what you thought about Kate and Kim Jiho love story. What should our next story be about? Should we do more Mafia Romance, Forbidden Love? Let me know in the comments. And to everyone celebrating, I wish you a beautiful new year filled with love and joy. Until next time, keep believing in second chances and the power of love to heal all wounds. See you in the next video.